All right, so welcome back to the Young Idealist and my ongoing series on classical German philosophy. And today I have a special guest. I have Christopher P. Noble, or Chris Noble, who is a historian of philosophy with a primary focus on the work of Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. So Dr. Noble is currently an assistant professor of philosophy at the New College of Florida, a public liberal arts and honors college located in Sarasota, Florida. Dr. Noble's research focuses on the interactions between traditional metaphysical ideas and the 17th century mechanical philosophy. So welcome, Dr. Noble, for being here today.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. My pleasure.
Part of the reason why I asked you to be on here is because you, in particular, work on early modern philosophy, 17th century thinking, great metaphysical ideas, and especially Leibniz. And Leibniz is such a key thinker when it comes to other thinkers like Kant, especially with Schelling, my first love, and Hegel, many other thinkers as well too. So just before we begin, I was wondering if maybe you could tell us who Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz was and what makes his philosophical thinking important for today.
Yeah. So Leibniz, you can think of him as sort of at the beginning of the grand tradition of classical German philosophy. Obviously, as you mentioned, sort of very, very important in terms of some of his arguments and framing of problems for the later critical philosophical traditions. Obviously for the sort of Wolffian tradition that followed immediately after Leibniz. So a very key figure in that story of sort of the growth and emergence of the sort of once again the grand German classical philosophical tradition. He was sort of known as an Universalgelehrter in German, sort of universally learned person, a polymath. So he made great contributions, of course, to philosophy, to mathematics, notably the calculus. One of the inventors of that particular mathematical procedure. Also a historian, had a hand in across the sciences in his day. Very interested in Chinese thought, Chinese intellectual, and in so many different things, so many different developments in early modern Europe. And sort of, for me, and I'll talk more about this, I think, when we come to some of his works, sort of a hinge between sort of, the sort of classical philosophy, sort of medieval philosophy, and then into modern, and then into German idealism, and later continental analytic philosophy. So sort of straddles all of these sorts of lines, where he's inheriting and developing ideas from Plato, Aristotle, other classical sources, in sort of engaging with the new mechanical philosophy, folks like Descartes, Bacon, et cetera, and sort of integrating those things, and then sort of once again setting the stage for so much of what happens afterwards. And then for me, sort of biographically, sort of the reason why I got into Leibniz myself was I actually had a background in what we think of as continental philosophy. So I was interested in folks like Kant and Heidegger and Gadamer. And so I read people like Spinoza, and then I came to Leibniz, who and I'll talk more about this. I know you're going to, I think, be interested in the sort of the claim that this is the best of all possible worlds, right? So he's sort of famous for having these sort of very grandiose sort of things that he says, and Kant, for Kant, he was sort of the epitome of a dogmatic metaphysician who makes claims that reason can't make, goes beyond its bounds, and those sorts of things. So I had that image of Leibniz coming in, and then when I actually read Leibniz for the first time, and sort of took him seriously, I found this very incredibly beautiful system that I think had this really interesting logic that was sort of driving it. And so I got sort of hooked on that, even though I sort of thought it's just still sort of silly and ridiculous, things like the best of all possible worlds. I'll talk more about that, of course, later on. Found myself trying to understand and trying to get at what made Leibniz tick. And over time, what I sort of realized, and this is where I'm sort of coming back to your question about why it might be important to study him today, outside of just the sort of historical ways that he fits into so many different strands of philosophical thinking, is that for me, what I sort of came to realize is that he's someone who's trying to harmonize and synthesize so many different sort of ways of thinking and sort of, philosophical schools of thought. And he wasn't someone who wanted to sort of reject things that he read or encountered. He wanted to see how all ideas could sort of fit together into a larger harmony. And so sources, from, different traditions, different schools of thought. I mentioned his interest in China earlier, the different cultures, and sort of integrating them together. And not, taking ideas seriously and not trying to reject them, and trying to see, once again, how you can build something sort of constructive by bringing them together. That sort of image of a synthesizer, of a constructive sort of linker of different ideas became very important. And I just, I think for me, it's a sort of very different attitude towards philosophy than I think many of us get trained in. Certainly, I think it's like the analytic tradition, where you're sort of once again trying to constructively unite and link, as opposed to sort of reject and say this doesn't make any sense, so it's not important. And so for me, that's really one of the key reasons why I've sort of stuck with Leibniz and really sort of think he's worth thinking with today.
Well, that was really a fantastic answer, actually. And I kind of share your enthusiasm with Leibniz, because I mean, for a long time, I was just absorbed in Spinoza, and then later found a love for Malebranche, but then started really reading, as you say so nicely, the systematic unities and connections that Leibniz has over these great systems of thinking. So I share some enthusiasm there with you. And I like the fact that you brought in a kind of history of ideas here, and you connect them all along. Very nice. Could you perhaps give us a brief biography of Leibniz's life, perhaps maybe dealing only with the main events, if you like? You don't have to make it an exhaustive biography. I know this is, when I asked this question to any other guests, you could see the kind of shock and worry go through their face at first, because they're like, oh my gosh, I have to remember all these dates. But no, just important ideas, that maybe could flesh out the thinker for us.
Yeah, so as I mentioned, he was born in 1646 in Leipzig, so in a sort of Lutheran area of the Holy Roman Empire at the time. And it's very important sort of contextually that it's at the sort of tail end of the 30s War, sort of this, this long-running, conflict within, primarily within the Holy Roman Empire, between different confessional forms of Christianity, sort of the Catholics, the Lutherans, the Calvinists, and so that sets the stage for a lot of what Leibniz was up to, because, as I mentioned earlier, he's a sort of harmonizer. He's trying to bring together different ideas that includes different theological ideas with philosophy, right? So he's not just, once again, unifying different philosophical schools of thought, but also trying to show how different forms of theology can be compatible both with each other and also with philosophy. I think one reason the scholars often point to is because, yeah, he's growing up in this period of very bitter, or he's born at this period of very bitter sort of confessional fighting, a very bloody fighting. And so that's sort of that immediate context. And his father was a professor of moral philosophy at the University of Leipzig, enrolled in the Nikolai-Schule, sort of preparatory school, at the age of 7, I believe. And then at the age of 8, so he had this sort of formal education, sort of this rigorous sort of preparatory school education in logic and rhetoric and Lutheranism. But then also was fortunately given access to his father's library at the age of 8. And he talks about these ways that he was this autodidact, sort of going through his father's books, sort of unsupervised, right? He was sort of given the keys to this library, and then sort of had this playground of ideas, and so absorbed all of these sort of books that his father had, in terms of philosophy, theology, et cetera, et cetera. And so that's like his childhood, right? He's sort of learning this stuff on his own at the same time as he's going through this preparatory school education. He gets degrees in philosophy and law. Does not practice law as far as I remember, but does eventually becomes involved in these sort of projects of reconciling different groups of Christians in in Mainz, so the Catholic city of Mainz. He finds himself a patron there, who's sort of interested in trying to bring together these different kind of confessional groups. His patron sponsors a trip to Paris, which is a very important trip. He arrives in 1672, which is where he learns mathematics. He meets with people like Christian Huygens, learns mathematics there. That's where he sort of begins to develop the calculus. Travels to London, becomes a fellow of the Royal Society of London, sort of is engaging with key figures in natural philosophy in places like Paris and London, sort of these very important intellectual cities at the time. And then, unfortunately, his patron dies, and he finds support with Duke Johann Friedrich of Hanover, of the Braunschweig-Lüneburg their family, and unfortunately has to then leave Paris to go back to Hanover. One important detail, which might be of interest, is that on the way from Paris to Hanover, he stops in The Hague, where he meets with Spinoza, whom he'd been trying to learn more about. He had read the TTP earlier on in the 1670s, and then had the opportunity once again to meet with Spinoza, I think, sort of with the help of his friend, with their mutual friend, Ehrenfried Walter von Schierenhaus. And I think that's one of those things where I love to be a fly on the wall in their conversations and really see what they actually sort of talked about. So this visit and sort of meeting with Spinoza, where Spinoza becomes this important figure for Leibniz, where he's very interested in Spinoza, but also finds it quite monstrous, the idea of sort of one substance and these sorts of things, everything happening of necessity without any other sort of possibilities. So there's this very interesting relationship that they have with one another, sort of philosophically and conceptually, which might come back to later on. When he arrives in Hanover, he engages in a range of different philosophical projects, including things like encyclopedias and a thing called the general science, which is to facilitate the growth and organization of knowledge, universal characteristics, sort of ideas for a sort of universal language. He's engaged in these sorts of projects. 1686, he publishes, or he doesn't publish, but he composes a very important work philosophically called the Discourse on Metaphysics, which is a really, really fascinating work, and sort of often an entry point into Leibniz, and where he talks about a sort of his notion of substance, rehabilitating Aristotelian substance and theories of form. Also very famously, the complete concept theory, which I can talk about a little more detail later on. And then engages in a correspondence with the theologian Antoine Arnauld. So he shares this work with Arnauld, who finds this horrifying because it leads to, according to Arnauld, a type of fatalism, right? So there's no real freedom according to this sort of theory of substance. And that's a very famous correspondence, the correspondence between Leibniz and Arnauld. And then let's say 1695 is a sort of 1694, 1695 is an important milestone period for his philosophical development. Including the publication of works like an essay on the correction of substance, so restating his new account of substance, rehabilitation of Aristotelian substance, the Specimen Dynamicum, so his theory of forces presented in a published work in the Acta Eruditorum, and then also the new system of the nature and communication of substances, which is where the first sort of formulation of the pre-established harmony, or the doctrine that will come to be called the pre-established harmony, which is so important for so much of later German philosophy. That's 1695. Engages with discussions about that text with people like Pierre Bayle, which is very fascinating. And then, sort of continues doing a lot of philosophical projects in the early 18th century. Correspondences that are very important with folks like Bertrand de Volder, Bartholomew de Bose, a Jesuit. And also writes the New Essays on Human Understanding, which is a sort of very almost point-by-point refutation of Locke's essay, which is very important for the sort of epistemology and sort of rationalism versus empiricism as a sort of topic. The Theodicy of 1710, which is his very famous defense of God's justice, so coining that term theodicy, which is one of the places he defends this best of all possible worlds doctrine. It's a book-length treatment of the problem of divine justice, that despite the evil that we witness and experience in our lives, that this is in fact it's all for the best. So that's 1710. And then other famous works in philosophy include the Principles of Nature and Grace of 1714, as well as the Monadology, a short work that he composes in that same year. And that's maybe his most famous philosophical text. And I think we're going to talk about monads a little bit later on as well. So.
Well, that was a very detailed biography, so thank you very much for that. And then I think that the viewers will get something really special out of what you just said. By the way, I can't help but notice you have the passion in your eyes and your tone when you speak about Leibniz. It's very nice. When I read Leibniz, or when I look at a lot of his works, it seems like he's always in he always has an interlocutor. It seems like he's always, and you had just mentioned that he had, wrote the Discourse on Metaphysics and then sent it to Arnaud, and Arnaud was, thought this was a disaster. I was just wondering, after you had mentioned that, who are Leibniz's philosophical influences, and how do you think these particular thinkers affect his own philosophy, or maybe interlocutors too?
Yeah, no, and that's sort of helpful, because I was going to sort of make that point as well, right? That so as I mentioned sort of earlier, Leibniz is, he's someone who wants to bring together all these different sort of schools of thought, right? So in terms of influences, the Platonic tradition, the Aristotelian tradition, I'll talk more about sort of the ideas and the divine intellect of possible things, sort of from the sort of Platonist strand of thinking, the sort of nature, the concept of substance, which he sort of takes from, develops from Aristotelianism, Aristotelian scholasticism, and then also sort of there's ways in which he's connecting with certain forms of atomism from the sort of classical tradition. He's not a materialist by any means, but as one way that he describes the monad, which is sort of his very sort of mature kind of spiritual atom, right? Sort of spiritual building block of the universe. And so there's ways in which sort of atomistic ways of thinking are very important for Leibniz as well. Now, and this is not something that I know much about at all, but I was going to recommend one book that I recommend certainly to viewers. I'll mention this again later on, is sort of Maria Rosa Antoniazza's, the late Maria Rosa Antoniazza's intellectual biography of Leibniz. And so this is one of the sources where she'll argue that he's also really shaped and informed by these traditions of encyclopedists in sort of Central Europe at the time, people who were pedagogical reformers, the traditions of Ramon Lull and Petrus, folks like Alsted and Biesterfeld. And so these are early sort of influences that, according to scholars like Antoniazza's, really shape his conciliatory, harmonizing practice, because they're sort of, likewise trying to sort of show the connections between things. In terms of modern philosophy, he encounters mechanical ideas early on. And he'll talk about sort of he'll tell these stories later on about sort of debating between the ancients and the moderns, between sort of the mechanical world views of folks like Descartes, who are quantifying and trying and sort of articulating laws of motion that can explain physical phenomena quantitatively, and sort of debating that between that and Aristotle, and ultimately he tries to sort of fuse them together, and so that's sort of in terms of, once again, that sort of bringing together all these different sort of ways of thinking. So that's sort of, in terms of influences, it's almost, he's drawing together all of these different sort of, sort of, once again, schools of thought. And then, yeah, in terms of your point, right? So he's also someone who very much likes doing philosophy in dialogue, right? And so a lot of the very important philosophical documents that scholars look at and write about in sort of context of the history of philosophy are correspondences, right? So I mentioned the correspondence with Arnaud, which is, received a great deal of attention. Folks like the correspondence with Bartholomew de Bos, which you can really see him trying to bring together his metaphysics with the accounts of the Eucharist, so transubstantiation and these sorts of things, and trying to build a philosophical account that can be consistent with these sorts of theological doctrines. That's a sort of important correspondence. Really fruitful philosophical relationships with Sophie, the wife of, I'm going to get this wrong, I believe it's Georg Ernst, so the second Hanoverian patron that he had after Johann Friedrich died. Sophie, Electra Sophie, and her daughter Sophie Charlotta, they were very important sort of philosophical interlocutors for Leibniz. And so, yeah, so scholars sort of look at often, these sort of correspondences where one of the things that Leibniz is doing, right, he doesn't necessarily present his philosophy sort of, right up front, but he'll sort of answer questions and sort of push the interlocutor towards, what he wants them to sort of understand. And so it's often this sort of long process of, misunderstanding, and then once again restatement, and then further question, and then there's a restatement. One in correspondence that functions that way is the very late correspondence with Samuel Clarke, who's sort of the representative of Newton. 1715, I want to say most, or very end of Leibniz's career. And you read these back and forths about sufficient reason, and sort of, well, does it mean this, and means that, why is it different from what you said there? And so these sort of back and forths that sort of hopefully get somewhere, but don't necessarily, right? In terms of get to some sort of mutual understanding. But yeah, so in terms of how Leibniz operated, he doesn't necessarily give you something like a just systematic presentation of the philosophy, but instead he's engaging with specific people who he's maybe trying to figure out what they think or what they want to hear, and then giving them something that he thinks they might want to hear, getting perhaps a not positive response, and then trying again. And so there's certain levels of frustration that might come out in some of these correspondences as well. But that's one of the sort of things that, yeah, if you read these sort of back and forth, you'll see this sort of active trying to sort of tweak and present exactly his position, what position he wants to adopt in that particular correspondence or conversation. Yeah.
I really like how you kind of disclose this dialogical formation of his thinking through his interlocutors, but also the encyclopedists, and of course the Cartesians and Aristotle and Plato. So thank you very much for that very rich answer, actually. My question now to you is, do you think you could briefly explain what Leibniz means by a principle of sufficient reason?
Yeah, no, happy to. So, Leibniz likes to articulate principles, right, which sort of guide and sort of shape the sort of philosophical positions he's taking, right, constrain and sort of show what is not viable versus what is viable. And the principle of sufficient reason is one of the sort of chief and most famous of these principles. And just for example, in the Monadology, sort of 1714, he says, that our reasoning is based on sort of two principles. So the principle of contradiction on the one hand, right, and then the principle of sufficient reason. And the principle of contradiction governs sort of necessary truths, eternal truths, things that can't be otherwise. That the opposite involves a contradiction. And so that sort of governs, once again, the realm of necessary truths. And then the principle of sufficient reason governs the realm of contingent truths, which are things that could be otherwise. And why this is important, well, given that there could be many different possible ways the world could be, or that we could be acting, we need something like a guide to why this is the way things actually are, right? And so for Leibniz, that principle of selection is the principle of sufficient reason, right? So in other words, for any given thing, there's a reason why it's that way and not otherwise, right? Any given contingent thing, that is, a thing that could have been otherwise. There's a reason why it's that way and not otherwise. And so that means a lot of different things for Leibniz, and has lots of different places he applies that within his sort of systematic thinking. And sort of the most important for me is that it's not simply saying that for everything there's a cause, right? And in some sense, there's sort of, it's going to mean that for everything there's multiple causes at different levels of the metaphysical sort of account. So for instance, there is an efficient causal story of why we're here talking to each other virtually. That's in terms of physics, in terms of sort of the motions of bodies and interactions of bodies. But for Leibniz, it's also very important that we can tell that story from the standpoint of final causes, or of purposes or ends, right? And the reasons why those efficient causes sort of unfolded the way that they did. So it was somehow deemed better for us to both be here. We both decided it was good for us to be here, right? So then something that's the sort of the reason for a certain efficient causal series to unfold. And he'll link that to Plato's account in the Phaedo of why sort of it's better for Socrates to be where Socrates is in the Phaedo. It's not merely material causes. But then also in terms of sort of the overall metaphysical reasons why things are the way they are, it's also very important that he gives a sort of cosmological argument on this basis, right? Because he says, okay, things could be lots of different possible ways. We could have different color hair. We could be in different places than we are currently. And so because that series of causes is infinite, can't find the ultimate reason for why this particular series obtains in the series itself. And so you have to go, according to Leibniz, sort of extra mundane, sort of beyond the world. And there's a text called On the Ultimate Origination of Things, I believe from 1697, where he makes this argument that there has to be a reason outside of the world for the particular series of causes in the world. And that ultimate reason is God, right? So there's this way in which, everything has a cause, but you can give different causal stories, and the ultimate reason, the ultimate sufficient reason, is going to be located in God, having deemed that it is better for it to be this way as opposed to any other way. Now, I also want to mention two other contexts where I think this is very significant for Leibniz specifically. And so what we think of as the sort of philosophy of science, he uses it actually to reject certain scientific hypotheses. So, for instance, if you want to say something like, I believe in a void, well, there's no reason for empty space, right? There's more reason for it to be full. And so something like sufficient reason is going to justify the rejection of something like what you might think was an empirical theoretical hypothesis from the standpoint of rational sort of, a priori speculation, right? You say, well, there's just no reason why God would have made things that way, empty, right? It's better, there's more reason for God to have made it full. And then another place actually is in free will. So if everything that happens has a reason, it can't be just that we are, as rational individuals, are sort of indifferently choosing what we do, right? There has to be something that inclines us, that makes it appear better for us to act one way than the other. He's going to say there's a reason why we choose those things. And those reasons, they might be subconscious in some level, right? They might not be fully explicit and fully conscious. But when you ate that thing for lunch, or when you did this nice thing for your friend, it's not like you just indifferently made a free choice, but there's a sort of causal explanation, causal reason that led to that. And so that's very important. And he sort of, he'll talk about sort of the bird and donkey case of the donkey sort of stuck between two carrots in that sort of context. And, if it truly was indifferent, if there truly was no reason for it to prefer one carrot to the other, it would just sit there forever and starve, basically, right? So there has to be something like a reason inclining you one direction as opposed to another. So in, let's say, the context of free will. I can mention one more thing which might be relevant, certainly to folks like Kant. Leibniz will argue that bodies are ultimately phenomena, right? They're appearances. And then beyond those phenomena, there are substances. And one name for those substances that he'll use is monads, right? And so the monad at that level functions as the reason for the phenomena, right? It's not just like the phenomena are just given and there's no explanation or there's no sufficient reason. That reason is located, so to speak, behind the phenomena in the substance. And so you can sort of see, if you're interested in Kant, the sort of the phenomenal noumenal distinction there, sort of how Leibniz sort of navigates that.
Well, thank you for that that reference to Kant. And also, your students are very, very lucky. You are a fantastic lecturer, and you do such a great job at bringing concepts, breaking down, difficult concepts and unpacking them for the viewer and for myself as well too. So I thank you for that. My next question. Now, there's a reason why I asked this question, because when people look up Leibniz and think of this fourth question to you, they normally have the reference of Dr. Pangloss from Voltaire's Candide, which of course is a character created by Voltaire in order to mock Leibniz. And so when we think of the best of all possible worlds, and of course there's all of this, there's war and there's incest and multiple different things going on in Candide, and Voltaire is obviously mocking and Leibniz here. So I think it's good that we get a grasp at what he means. So Leibniz is known for this statement that this is the best of all possible worlds. So my question to you is, what does he mean by this statement, and how does it play out in his metaphysics?
Yeah, I mean, it is linked to this account of sufficient reason, right? So Leibniz is insistent that there are lots of different possible ways things could have been, right? We could have had different, once again, hair colors and chosen different career paths and this sort of thing. And so those possibilities are fully real and they exist in God's intellect. And so given that feature of how God thinks, that he's, let's say, prior to creation in some sort of hypothetical time prior to creation, God's thinking about all these different sort of possible ways things could have been or could be, that God could create the world. And he has to choose, right? He can't create all of them other than some standard of bestness, right? And say this is the one that wins in this sort of cosmological competition. And in that essay, The Ultimate Iteration of Things, he talks about like a metaphysical mechanism unfolding in God's mind, that sort of these worlds are sorting themselves in terms of like how good they are. And in the Theodicy, he presents an image of a pyramid with apex is the best world, and then there's a sort of pyramid descending, I think it's indefinitely, right? So of lesser worlds that could have been, right? So so this, once again, this statement that's as you said, very well known and mocked by Voltaire, there's a sort of conceptual reason why Leibniz says that, right? That in other words, how else could God have chosen a world to create, right? He had to have some sort of standard. Suffering and death and all the things that Voltaire describes, I'm sure in some form or another have happened in the world, right? And so this is supposedly, these are all ingredients or parts of the best way things could have been, right? And so at a practical level, what does that mean for us, right, who have to deal with this situation from our own perspectives? And he'll say, of course, that if we had the divine perspective, then we would know why it's the best, right? That it is in fact the most beautiful. He'll talk about criteria such as the sort of balancing simplicity of laws, right? So there's a sort of order. There's not too many different laws governing how things sort of happen causally, with the greatest variety. And so I think the challenge is to somehow say, okay, well, yes, we know at this sort of conceptual level that this is the best world, despite our experience of it. And then how do we then respond, right? And so we could, on the one hand, hate God, right, for saying, this is the world that you're stuck with. And that's not the response Leibniz wants us to take, right? And in fact, Leibniz sort of, I think he thinks that if we choose that, to blame God for having created things this way, then we're going to sort of spiral into depression and some unhappiness, right? Because we're going to sort of see more and more of that evil and make ourselves more and more sad. But instead, if we sort of focus on the good or are optimistic about things, so to speak, then we see more and more how things are actually sort of really interesting and beautiful, right? And the reasons why things work the way that they do. And also from a practical perspective, we will sort of act charitably and justly towards others, right? We'll sort of be good neighbors to others, he thinks, right? So in some sense, it's a way, even if it's impossible for us to really understand, the more we sort of internalize that, Leibniz thinks, then the more we're going to sort of contribute to things being better, right? And things getting better. And so, he wants to prevent us from sort of hating God and blaming him for creating us, and instead sort of trying to see the ways in which the world is good. And then that will sort of bootstrap us to act towards improving the world further. And so that's sort of, I think, at the practical level, how we're really supposed to think about it. Now, I mentioned this, and I say this to my students, it's in terms of the correspondences and sort of how he presents his ideas. I often say, he gives you what he thinks you want to hear, right? They'll make you feel better. Supposed to want to hear this. First, does it actually successfully convince us to work towards the good, to know that, despite appearances, this is in fact the best world.
Well, thank you for that. That was a very nice answer, and I think you did a great job of explaining the method behind it and and proving why it's pertinent to Leibniz. So thank you for that. So now we reach the fifth question, which is we've brought up what monads are. We've talked about them a little bit. And now the question is, what are monads, and how does Leibniz employ the monads in his kind of greater philosophical system?
Yeah, so it's so the monads is most famously associated with the Monadology, or the text that's known as the Monadology. I think is sort of titled "The Principles of Philosophy." I think was one of Leibniz's working titles for it. And so it's associated with text 1714, I believe. The term sort of emerges in Leibniz's sort of lexicon in the mid-1690s, and it's around the time where he's really starting to once again come back and present his metaphysics, his philosophy publicly in works like the New System, Specimen Dynamicum, etc. And in that context, he begins talking. He's talking about how there must be unities at sort of the base of the natural world or of reality, right? If you don't have unities, you won't have any of the sort of phenomena, which are sort of ultimately aggregates or combinations of unities. And so the term monad, sort of associated with unity, becomes this term for substance, or a simple substance without parts, that he sort of locates at the sort of the building blocks of reality, or of metaphysics. There is sort of textual sort of ways that he's trying to, he's presenting in different ways, but ultimately a sort of simple substance that sort of grounds, if you will, sort of physical reality, right? Sort of phenomenal reality, which is sort of aggregates. So monads are spiritual unities, and then bodies are sort of aggregates of those unities, combinations that enter into relationships with one another. Now, in terms of the sort of metaphysics itself, it's sort of important to know that for Leibniz, no substances can interact directly. He rejects the notion of a sort of an influx or influence that substances have over one another. So in other words, I don't know if we're talking about us as two monads, the sort of he'll say the dominant monad of your body, which is sort of like your soul. If we're sort of talking to one another, spontaneous unfolding of each of our own natures, and sort of in response to one another's indirectly, but in a way that sort of agrees with one another. So, we're not sort of interacting directly in the sense of like causing influences upon one another, but we are sort of appear to interact in that way. And really what's happening is sort of our own internal perceptions are unfolding according to their natures. And once again, it looks like they're interacting. That's just because God has set it up so that we appear to be interacting. And that's a sort of very important key feature of the theory. So everything sort of acts spontaneously, and then there's the appearance of interaction in terms of our bodies and so on and so forth. But it's really a sort of program or series of perceptions that's unfolding internally within a monad. Now, one of the things that I'm particularly interested in with the sort of the theory of substance in general, and then the theory of the monad in particular, is sort of some of the analogies that Leibniz uses to characterize them. And I think often, he does have technical argumentation, but often a sort of powerful image is something that he likes to throw in to sort of, jolt you into thinking, as it were. And one of the famous, comparisons he makes with monads is that they're the living mirrors of the universe. That is, they say they reflect everything around it. So the infinity of other monads are sort of all reflected in a given monad from its own perspective. It sort of once again mirrors everything else, right? It's sort of actively carrying out its program that agrees with the programs of all the other monads, and once again reflects or expresses them as a mirror, so to speak. And the other image that, in terms of the monad, is that at one point in the Monadology, he characterizes monads as "quote unquote" incorporeal automata. And in other places, he'll use the term spiritual automaton to describe substances, or the souls of substances. And for me, that's a very important image or analogy or model, because it, at least I've argued, is sort of brings together these traditional conceptions of the soul, of a form of a living thing, with a sort of more modern sort of mechanical notion of an automaton, a sort of robot or clockwork that appears to move itself via its mechanical sort of organization. And so at the heart of this theory of substance is this comparison with something like a robot or a sort of machine carrying out a certain program of activity. And for me, that's been very important in, once again, thinking about how he's unifying these different philosophical traditions. And there's a sort of sense in which even this sort of spiritual being is sort of acting mechanically in this sort of analogous way at any rate. And for those of you who are interested in Kant, Kant rejects that particular thesis in the Second Critique. He famously calls that if Leibniz were right, our freedom would not be real freedom; it would be the freedom of a turnspit or a Pratenwender. So sort of this thing that you spin to roast meat. I don't know why Kant picked that particular mechanism, but that's what he sort of critiqued Leibniz's account of freedom or sort of spontaneity with. So something else that I've been particularly interested in terms of sort of Leibniz and Leibniz studies, and this is sort of the build of folks like Smith, of Ohad Nachtomi, is that sort of this notion of the incorporeal or spiritual automaton is also linked to what sort of a biological notion of a living body, because corresponding to every monad or these sort of spiritual atoms is also what Leibniz calls an organic body that is a living body, which in Leibniz's sort of way of thinking is an infinitely complex, what he called machine of nature, and sort of a sort of mechanism designed by God or preformed by God. And so this is sort of one of Leibniz's sort of contributions to what we think of as the life sciences or biology, where in order to understand what distinguishes living bodies, the bodies of humans, of plants, of animals, from inanimate bodies, is that they have this infinitely complex mechanical structure. All have this sort of incorporeal spiritual automaton, which carries out a program of activity that reflects the entirety of the world. And then on the other hand, this sort of body, which is infinitely complex. And he literally means that it has infinitely many organs or functional parts. And in works like The New System, he argues that that means you're actually naturally immortal, or your body will never be destroyed in the course of nature, because no matter how many parts you lose or get damaged, you always have more. And that's sort of, once again, your sort of divinely preformed, infinite organic structure.
Well, now that is fantastic. I really liked how you segued into from monad into a kind of history or philosophy of science, along with Leibniz's work, and also highlighting some of your work, which is fantastic. And I will link all of the sections of your website where they can find titles of your work in the video. So one last question. If someone wanted to, a younger student or any kind of person, an enthusiast in philosophy, wanted to pick up a piece by Leibniz, where do you think the best place to start is?
Yeah, it's a tough question. So, on the one hand, it sort of, I think, depends on what your interests are. Are they in metaphysics? Are they in practical philosophy? Where your sort of, once again, your sort of connections to Leibniz might be, or in terms of later history. But one thing, of course, about Leibniz and sort of, he much of his works are sort of short texts, right? So he did publish a book, the Theodicy, that's sort of a full-length book. The New Essays ends up being a sort of book-length work. But much of his work is, I don't want to say fragmentary, because it just sort of short texts, right? And so in sort of the English, this is a standard edition, which is the sort of philosophical essays by Ariev and Garber. That's a great place to go to get a taste of what Leibniz was up to. It doesn't include a lot of the earlier stuff, so that's a sort of way that I think you get a particular vision of what Leibniz was philosophically. It leaves a lot of that stuff out, but a lot of the very influential material that gets talked about quite a bit, you'll find in this work. And there is some of the earliest stuff in terms of the universal characteristic, that plans for a universal language that you find in the Arya of Garber. So that's a sort of a good primary source place to start. I mentioned this work earlier. This is Antoniazza's, the late Maria Rosa Antoniazza's intellectual biography of Leibniz, which is fantastic work. Really, just a really great read in terms of the sort of intellectual context and his life. And then last but not least, if you want a sort of secondary by Richard T.W. Arthur, which is just entitled Leibniz, I believe from 2014. He also has some more recent books on, 2 books on sort of monads and composition is the first book, and then on space and relativity and time, which get in much more detailed sort of engagements with metaphysical topics. But this is a sort of good general overview of Leibniz's sort of metaphysics and natural philosophy. So those are the sort of the places that I would really recommend starting, and then going from there.
Yeah, I think those are great recommendations. I actually have the 2 texts that you put up, the one text from Hackett and the other text on the kind of rich biography on Leibniz. Well, thank you very much for such a lively discussion about Leibniz, his life, his thought, for navigating myself and the viewer right through an enormous project. So that is a great feat. So thank you. And for also sharing your research with us. And I do hope you come back when the book is finished. And thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.